All right, good morning, Azusa Pacific. It's good to see you this morning. Um, Grab your book. Let's talk about Fitch for a little bit. Uh, last time we talked McIntyre, we talked traditions, we talked all those words. We talked about how the church has to operate in postmodernity as this um, location of it's either Nietzsche or Aristotle. It's either there's nothing out there or there's something out there, but we have to socially embody it, historically extend it. And so the church, as a kind of McIntyrean tradition, living out our faith. Um, but Fitch wants to argue we have all these pressures that have shaped us from modernity. And the first one he wants to deal with, and the chapter 1 begins on page 27, with this question of success and the way in which the church has been shaped by understandings of success. So go to page 28, about halfway through the second paragraph on the page. He says this: "Herein lies the danger, because as the criticizers of modernity teach us, effectiveness can itself become a value that may be at odds with the purposes of the church. Effectiveness and efficiency draw their agendas from American cultural forces that define success in terms of numbers, size, and capital. This kind of effectiveness can be alien to Christ's church. We therefore need to re-examine what is effectiveness in terms of faithfulness to God's call to be the church and why we are so attracted to big numbers." So what he's saying here is one of the main values in modernity was this issue of effectiveness. How can we do things better, faster, cheaper? Shaped by the Industrial Revolution, shaped by scientific theories about work and how what's the most effective way to get people to work. You had all of a sudden the development of industry lines and manufacturing lines, and so work is thought of as efficient. And so if you watch most commercials about business, they'll use words like this: faster, cheaper, better. And so this efficiency became important, and we became valuers of things that were maybe not historic. So where in a previous culture we may have valued place, we may have valued tradition, now we begin to value things like bigness and effectiveness, and even things like conspicuous consumption become important. And so especially for a while, bigger cars were better than smaller ones in terms of they're more prestigious. A bigger house is better than a smaller house. Bigger is almost always better within modernity. And so the church then got shaped by a lot of those values. So I wrote in the margin on page 28, when I read this, I wrote the ABCs of church. The ABCs of church are this: attendance, buildings, and cash. So, during the modern time period, if someone asked you, you get together with all your pastor friends and they said, how was your ministry going? What they were really asking was the ABC question: how's your attendance? Have you built any new buildings? And how much cash have you raised? And so you'd answer by saying, oh man, things are growing great. We're up 100 from where we were last year. We're in the middle of building this new family life center. It's going to be super great. And I don't know what's going on, but even in the midst of a recession, our giving is up 12%. So, those are the ways that we would talk about whether a church was doing well or not, and the ways in which we thought about that. So he wants to talk a bit about the way efficiency and a modernistic view of success has shaped our understanding of church. And then he gets into some hypothetical examples to say, the problem is if we define church as being the genuine body of Christ, you might have a church of 1,000 where only 80 people are connected to each other, connected to Christ in ways that we might call them the true church, but we'd say, oh, that's a great church. Where a church of 200 may really be committed to being the body of Christ in the world, but may be seen as not as successful as the church of 1,000, even though you have 200 deeply connected living disciples at a church, and the big church only has 90. So how you quantify success gets really tricky then for Fitch in the church. So we're deeply shaped by this issue of effectiveness, um, but we're also deeply shaped by individualism. And so let me talk a little bit about the nature of individualism, and I'll talk to you about one of my favorite books that I've ever read, and some of you maybe have heard me talk about it before, but a guy named Robert Bellah, Bellah, Robert Bellah, in the 80s wrote a book called The Habits of the Heart. Habits of the Heart. It's a sociology text, and it's a text that he wrote with did all this research on why people make commitments and why how we speak about, and as Americans in particular, how Americans talk about their commitments. And what he found, and what his team found at the end of this huge study of American life and American commitment, they found that Americans speak what they called kind of four languages with regards to commitment. Four languages. Now, not German, English, French, Latin, etc., but a kind of grammar, a kind of logic, four sort of systems, ways of thinking and speaking that generally embody the way most Americans speak about their relationships. And the first two are forms of individualism. Okay, so I want you to get these down. They will be on the test. I wish I could write them on the board for you. Sorry, but the first is what he calls utilitarian, U-T-I-L. Utiliarian, Utilitarian, utilitarian individualism. Utilitarian individualism means this: that we will commit to doing something as long as we can get a good answer to this question: what will I get out of it? I'll commit to this, but what will I get in return in terms of utility? What can I use out of this? What will I get in response to this? And so that's a very important question. If I commit to this, am I going to get something back in return that I can use? That's really the dominant language that Americans use when they speak about their relationships. That I'll get something back. The second form of language is also a form of individualism, but rather than being utilitarian, it's what he calls expressive individualism. So we have utilitarian individualism, but also then expressive individualism. This second form, expressive individualism, it recognizes there may be times when we make commitments to things that we're not going to get something out of it, but we may feel something. So, my wife, when we got married, worked in video production, and one of her first jobs was working for a nonprofit organization where she knew that when they would have dinners, that the videos she was making needed to touch our hearts in ways that said, I know that if you contribute to this organization to feed hungry people around the world, you're probably not going to get anything out of it, but I'm going to make you feel good. I mean, we're going to make you feel good about this child that you're feeding, this community that you're giving food to. And it's not a bad thing, but it says, we'll make this commitment, but we may not get anything out of it, but we're going to feel something. I mean, we may get a tax break out of it, but other than that, we're going to feel good about this. So those are the two language systems that Americans predominantly speak, are forms of utilitarian and expressive individualism. So let me give you the quick story. So my favorite story in the book, they interview a guy who's on his second marriage, and they say, tell us about your first marriage. Why did you love this woman? And so he lists all these things that she did for him. She was hot. I fell in love with her and was deeply attracted to her. She helped me get through college and an MBA program. We started a business together, and she was a great partner to me. She was a great mother to my children. So all these things that he listed about why he loved her were almost all forms of utilitarian individualism. They were forms of what she did for him. And then, but then what happened? Well, his children grew up and left home, so they decided to downsize, and the wife left him because the relationship was all about him, and she found somebody for whom it was all about her. So then they say, well, what did you tell us about your second marriage? Why did you love her? Well, now he doesn't need anything. His kids are raised. He has his business, all that. So The second woman he talks about almost entirely in terms of expressive individualism. Oh, she gets me. She understands me. She brings out the little boy in me. I love the me that I am when I'm with her. All forms of what Bella calls self-actualization. Forms of therapeutic actualization. I just love the way that she makes me feel. Well, then they would play a dirty trick on them. They would say, well, what would have happened if in your first marriage or now in your second marriage, your wife would have been in an accident of some kind, and in your first marriage she couldn't make you feel those things or couldn't do those things anymore, or now in your second marriage she couldn't make you feel those things anymore? What would you do? This was the key to the whole experiment. Was they would get people to talk about their commitments, and then they would ask, okay, but what if they didn't work for you anymore? What if you didn't feel anything anymore? And what they found was that overwhelmingly 99% of Americans, without hardly even thinking, would say, well, I'd stay in the commitment or I'd stay with the person. But then they would ask a follow-up question, why? And what they found is that Americans do this. Well, that we didn't have a language to express why we would stay in a commitment once it didn't work for us or once we didn't feel anything. That we had lost the language to explain how to stay in commitment. And because we've lost that language, it doesn't take very long, even though it's the habit of our heart, that's where the book title comes from, even though it's the habits of our heart to say we would stay, we've lost ways to describe that. And if you don't have any ways to describe it, you don't have any ways to imagine it. If you don't have any ways to imagine it, you usually don't have any ways of actually staying in it. And so we're not good at staying in those commitments because we don't have a way to think about them or express them, except for two other groups of people. I'm going to have to take a break and go to and come back and tell you what those two are. I know you can't wait to find out.